Okay, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. This session for the 2nd of October 2019 is about R-typed and handwritten exams equivalent by Liz Masterman and Jill Fresen from Oxford University in the UK. So Liz, I believe you're going to begin, please.
Right. Thank you very much, Matthew, and good morning or good evening, everybody, depending where you are. I'm really grateful to Matthew for inviting me to do this webinar because it was on the strength of a paper I wrote for the Ascolite conference last year, but I was unable to actually go there and give it. So this is a really welcome second opportunity, and hopefully it'll actually reach more people geographically. So to introduce us, until 2 days ago, I was senior researcher in digital education at the Centre for Teaching and Learning at Oxford University. Jill is a senior learning technologist in the same centre, and she was a project lead on our e-exams project. So she'll be monitoring the chat and facilitating the discussions. And if you've got any questions at the end about the practical aspects of the trial, I think she's the one to ask. Today, we are primarily reporting on a survey of the research literature we undertook as part of a project to trial e-exams at Oxford. This photograph shows the university's examination schools, which is the main and the most historic centre where exams are held, and it's definitely not equipped for e-exams. It needs a lot of work on it. Right. So I'll just do a quick outline. So I'll start by giving a little bit more background to the project, which included a literature survey. Then I'll briefly describe how we went about the literature survey before summarising the findings in 3 areas. I'll finish by considering the implications. So as Matthew said, please use the chat window to comment on the presentation, and we'll stop for discussion after each section. Probably more discussion than questions and answers, picking up on the topics that come up in the chats. We particularly like those of you who've run e-exams yourselves to contribute your experiences as well. So I think the first thing to do is to just establish a shared understanding of what we mean by e-exams. And this is how we defined it at Oxford. So vigilated essay-based exams in which students type their scripts either on their own laptops, which is known as Bring Your Own Device, BYOD, or on devices provided by the institution. And these are face-to-face exam settings, so not online, not distance invigilation or distance proctoring. Actually, they're in the room. So it is a bit different from the one that I know Matthew uses, because I think his work is exclusively looked at BYE. Actually, before we go on, I'd quite like to get a sense of your experience with the exams. So could you write yes or me in the text chat if e-exams are part and parcel of your university or college's assessment process? You're doing them fairly regularly. Good. Good, so we've got some of those, yes. So thank you. Oops, good. Because the next question I was going to ask you is if you've run at least one trial, and I can see we've got 1 or 2 trials. Have people done trials but not yet embedded them? Good. Smashing. Is anybody actually preparing for a trial? Oh, Laura is, yes, isn't she? So we've got some who are actually getting ready to do some trials. Super. So I think we can probably talk to everybody. So anybody else is just here because they're interested in the topic. Great. Okay, let's get on with our project. Oxford has been conducting objective assessments in a digital medium for about 10 years, more than that, but primarily medical sciences. But we published a digital education strategy, finally, in 2016, and that revealed an interest in doing some e-exams. So in the summer of 2017, a project was commissioned to lay the ground for a trial of e-exams informative assessments, and that was conducted in April 2018. So this project, as I said earlier, started with a landscaping task in which we surveyed the existing literature on e-exams and related topics for 2 main purposes. So the first one was, from a practical perspective, what could we learn from universities that have already tried them out? And from a cognitive perspective, can typed and handwritten exams be viewed as more or less equivalent? And what are the implications for the practicalities of that, what you might find out? And it's that purpose that we're focusing on today. But I'll just give you a quick what we did. So we used the Inspira e-exam platform with students typing their scripts into the Safe Exam browser, which they downloaded a few weeks before the exam to try it out. It involved 4 exams, 3 of which were writing essays, and 1 was actually a computer science exam where the students were writing computer code. Involved more than 70 students. We only allowed them to type their exams. They couldn't choose to handwrite, and this was because there was a fear that because the exams themselves, the serious exams, are handwritten, people might say, well, they want to handwrite for the practice. So we said, right, no choice. Well, the powers that be said no choice. There was a sort of, we used both bring your own device and university devices. The students doing theology and law could choose, but the computer science students had to use university computers because there was concern they might try to hack the Safe Exam browser between the time they downloaded it and the exam, which, as I said, was a few weeks apart. We evaluated the trials in May 2018. We gave the students a pre-exam survey and then another one after the exam, and interviewed the academics who were involved in organising the trial and marking the papers. The evaluation didn't focus on the question of equivalence, partly because there wasn't the choice, but we did ask students about the differences between typing and handwriting. Unfortunately, none of the academics succeeded in using the Inspira's on-screen marking tools. We couldn't ask them about the experience of marking on screen. This was a one-off trial. We'd hoped to follow it up, but plans are on hold for the present, but Inspira is still being used in medical sciences for their objective tests. Right, so let's move on to the literature survey we did and our key research questions. Why is it important to know why no handwritten and typed exams are equivalent? Well, Noyes and Garland provide as good a reason as any to ensure that overall outcomes in terms of marks are matched, and they suggest that this is more problematic in essay type exams than in the objective or multiple choice exams. So we broke the question into 3 parts. So for students sitting in the exam, does moving from handwritten to typed exams change the intellectual process of responding to an exam question and hence the length and stylistic features of the resulting response? And for markers, does moving from marking handwritten exam scripts to typed scripts change their perception of and attitude towards students' responses? And does moving from marking exam scripts on paper to marking them online change the actual intellectual process of marking an exam question? And if the move does result in change, is there a difference in the marks achieved and awarded, and should those differences be considered important? And so to answer those questions, we carried out an intensive search in Google Scholar over a 2-day period in late June 2017. Then I repeated the exercise a year later when preparing the paper for the ASCII conference. And the word cloud shows most of the terms we use. So there, as you can see, there are various ways of terms used for e-exams: typed, computer-based, computerized, etc. And the reason we cut off the 2000s was that older papers often describe software with outdated functionality, and some of the more recent research articles had reviewed that older literature too, so there was no need to revisit those old papers unless they were particularly relevant, and 1 or 2 actually were. And we followed up leads in the articles themselves and on the journal websites, and the websites in particular led us to the literature on writing in general, which was also very helpful. So in total, we got 40 articles relevant to our research question, 35 the first time round and an extra 5 in the second year. Right, so let's start with the first of the research questions and look at what the literature says. So I'll just remind you that the findings of those are other people's research, not our project, but do feel free to ask in discussion about the data that we collected. So in order to appreciate the potential differences between handwriting and typing exam responses, we found it helpful to get an overview of the fundamental process involved in composing text, whether it's in an exam or in more normal circumstances. And we came across something called Peverly, his survey of models of writing competence. which gave us a basic understanding of these processes. We're aware that obviously there are other models, and this one might actually be contentious, but it really served our purposes for what we were trying to do. So under exam conditions, there are 4 main steps in the writing process: planning, knowledge retrieval, and instead of a box there was supposed to be a little brain icon, but obviously the software couldn't handle the brain icon. And translating ideas into text and revising. So when you're translating your ideas into text, you've got 2 sort of sub-processes. You're turning the ideas you've got into language in working memory, and then actually getting that out on the page, transcribing and putting the text on the page. Obviously, these processes are iterative rather than, well, partly sequential, partly iterative, and some may come into play more than others. I mean, certainly when I was writing exams at school and university, I never got around to revising. I was always writing right up to the very end. So planning, knowledge retrieval, and generating the text itself are sort of high-level processes. And a student's capacity to carry these out depends in part on the efficiency with which they can actually do the writing, get the stuff down on the screen or paper. And Peverly suggests that the more fluently you can generate ideas and write or type them down, then the more of your working memory is free for actually crafting the prose into something that will make sense and the mark will be able to read. But of course, in an exam, you've got extra pressure on your processes. You're also got under pressure, you've got distracted attention, trying to get things out, you're being assessed, and that can have an impact on the quality of the responses. So let's have a look at what research data says about cognitive processes in composing an essay answer in an e-exam. Well, it's somewhat inconclusive in terms of the process of writing. The studies we read all rely on retrospective self-reports by students. So it was the case that handwriters said they spent more time planning. Typists said that they tended to rough out their response first and then expand it. And second, there were no conclusive differences, and the studies contradicted each other to some extent. So in one paper by Kohler, it seemed that typists did more revision, and then in one of Mathew's papers, it seemed that similar proportions of typists and handwriters had time to revise. And Lee has suggested that the exact nature of differences in the process may differ from student to student. So it's all a bit of a mess, really. I've got the next one. There we go. Right, good. Happily, things are a bit clearer when it comes to actually the finished product, the completed essay answer. And a number of studies have compared handwritten and typed scripts. And the main difference is length, in that students who type their answers generally produce longer responses than handwriters in several studies. But it's also important to note that how much a student writes or types depends also on how much they know and their analytical skills, as well as on how fast they can get everything down. And there's been research into comparing the length of sentences and the length of the paragraphs, and that's all a bit contradictory. But when you actually go into the linguistic features of the essays, there are possibly some differences. Lexical variation is the range of vocabulary used and the amount of repetition, and there appears to be a wider range in typed answers. Lexical density is the proportion of meaning-bearing words to functional words. So meaning-bearing words would be sort of strong nouns, strong adjectives, strong verbs, and functional words more like conjunctions and prepositions, things like that. And that seems to be lower in typed answers. And interestingly, it would appear that lexical variation and lexical density tend to be higher in handwriting than in speech. And it's actually been suggested that students may write in a more informal style on the computer than on paper. But that suggestion has also been contradicted. So it'd be really interesting if anybody in the webinar has had experience of comparing handwritten and typed answers to see whether they found any sort of stylistic differences and certainly length differences. So as we saw earlier, how fast a student can handwrite or type can determine how much of their brain, their working memory, is free to those higher level actions. So what Kohler says is the lack of fluency in lower order processes, such as keyboarding or handwriting, can constrain the higher order processes such as planning and reviewing. And this is where what your tool, what you're actually using to write, so a pen or the computer, actually can be come into play. So proficiency in typing has a greater impact on students' performance and how long they've been using computers. So that's more important than so how well they can type is more important than how long they've been using computers. And this is reflected when in some situations where students have been given the choice, students who are better typists will opt to type. And again, I'd like to hear from people as to whether they found, and they give people the choice, whether it's the more proficient typists who choose. But more proficient typists don't necessarily produce longer scripts. They might spend more time revising, or they might spend more time organizing the content. And then, of course, there's this worry that technical failure might go down. That can add even more pressure to distract their working memory. And there are studies, and ours included, that reported that students were feeling anxious about this, certainly beforehand. But speed isn't, as I've just said earlier, isn't just a function of how fast a student can type. It can also be affected adversely by the device they're using, and this is particularly the case where students are taking their exams on unfamiliar university computers. And a paper by Walker and Handley in 2016 uses the phrase IT proficiency for assessment, which is reflected in the capability to use unfamiliar technology under time pressure in computer-based exams. So the solution to that is for them to bring their own devices, but of course that raises lots of security issues. And actually, amid all these concerns about students' typing proficiency, it can be very easy to overlook the fact that there are very long-standing inequities in handwritten exams. And much earlier studies of handwriting have shown that speed and style, for example, whether students can write joined up or print, can have an impact on the output. And a paper by Augustine Adams and colleagues in 2001 has advised that where students can choose between typing and handwriting, they should type if they're proficient typists. Otherwise, it's better to spend time revising the content of your course than to improve your typing skills. But better still, learn to type proficiently before you come up to university. Right, that was an awful lot in those last few slides. So we're going to stop for a few minutes for some questions and comments and sharing. Jill, has anything cropped up in the chat window that you'd like to explore further? I'll hand over to
certainly.
you.
The chat window has been very active, and a few questions that we could reflect back on. Peter made a good comment about the LERU universities, that is the League of European Research Universities, that they've done a fair bit of work on this topic and have found that there are differences both in writing and marking. So that's interesting. Peter, I don't know if you'd like to say any more about that.
Peter, go ahead. There's a microphone button in the center of the screen if you'd like to speak, assuming you've got a microphone. Hey, Peter, did you find the microphone button in the middle of the bottom middle of the screen? Okay, no worries, Peter. Thank you.
Okay,
maybe just type your comment.
Thanks, Peter. We can follow up with you again later. Another interesting comment by Wendy T. She commented on the fact that students might suffer computer anxiety, and she was wondering if there's such a thing as pen anxiety. So yes, as Matthew commented, some students may be disadvantaged by being forced to type, but do we ever hear that they are disadvantaged by being forced to use a pen? I would comment that there are some other disadvantages and anxieties that may come along with handwritten exams, not necessarily using the pen itself. So I don't know if there are any more comments about using the pen or using the keyboard.
I mean, if I can just probably say it faster, I sort of found that, you know, people would get sore hands. I'm sure other people have done exam choice trials have found that too. There's the fine motor skills issue. People don't handwrite for long periods of time anymore, so they get hand cramps. I did sort of find that around a 70-minute mark, beyond that, people started really quite suffering from it. But shorter exams of, you know, a 1 hour wasn't a problem.
Good, thanks for elaborating on that, Matthew. Another one I'd like to pick up on is Fiona had a question when Liz was talking about lexical density. And Liz, I wonder if you could clarify what you were saying about lexical density and how that compares to handwriting, please.
I will try, but just remember this is reading. I'm not a linguistic expert. I'm just seeing if I can find, where was that slide? Lexical density. So, well, I think all I can say is probably what's in the literature, that is, I suppose you're thinking of more dense prose, sort of, I'm trying to think, ands and buts. I don't know whether it's difficult one to actually be able to recall, because it's a long time since I read the paper. What I could do is if you go to the one of the references at the end of the slide presentation, you will be able to find the reference to that original paper, and you'll be able to get more from it. It's something that, not being a linguist, an expert, I couldn't actually say too clear, but I certainly, when I've been editing, I've noticed that people can write very sort of long, stringy sentences with lots of passive verbs instead of strong, dynamic, active verbs, and which are much punchier. That's probably the best I can go. Sorry.
Okay, Liz, no, thank you for that response. And then I'll just turn it over to anyone who would like to raise their hand at this point.
Hi there, am I coming through?
Yes, Peter, I can hear you.
Good, lekker. I have, when I was looking at the Leroux stuff, there was some talk there that markers in some cases preferred handwriting because they felt it gave them a more spontaneous view of a student's response, whereas others found that they preferred the typed response because it put the answer in a much more structured and considered format. Have you seen any evidence of that in your work?
Liz is getting on to that in the next section, looking at responses and thinking processes from the point of view of markers. So Liz, I don't know if you'd like to answer Peter's question directly now or continue with the presentation.
Well, if there's nobody else and no other questions or comments, I can go straight on to the next bit. That's a very nice segue.
Yes, thank you. Please do.
Okay. I'll just skip over that next slide because we had some questions up our sleeves in case there wasn't. Right, let's move on to, as Peter sort of nicely introduced us to, what the literature says about marking e-exams. And again, remember, this is other people's research, not ours. So to answer Peter's question, what happens when a marker is faced with the student's script? Well, two of the obvious benefits is that markers don't have to do battle with illegible scripts and that errors are more visible. But there's a study by Powers and colleagues, and I think this is probably it's tying into what Peter's found, is that refers to a reader empathy effect, where the marker feels closer to the writer of a handwritten script. And they suggest that the marker may give the student the benefit of the doubt over illegible patches or interpret crossings out as evidence of the student's attempt to revise their work and then reward them accordingly. And of course, this will muddy the waters a bit. And if I just pop in a quote from one of the people who involved in our evaluation, he talked about the loss of connection with the student behind the script when it's typed. What he said was, what you're assessing is the quality of the mind, and the mind is the person, and the person is reflected in the handwriting. You perhaps skim over an illegible bit since you've got a general sense of what's going on. So I hope that sheds some light or chimes with Peter's experience. The second thing is that although typed exam answers tend to be longer than handwritten ones, they actually appear shorter to the eye. And this has actually caused the students in our evaluation a bit of a problem. They didn't feel they were writing enough. And this finding is important because research generally, but not universally, seems to suggest there's a positive correlation between the length of the response and the mark achieved, whether you've typed the response or handwritten it. And a number of studies have reported on suspected differences in markers' overall expectations. Oh, Peter, did you want to say something at that point?
Yes, sorry, it's probably easier for me to ask rather than write it. This isn't from a university, but from when I was in the corporate world, we found that actually changing the shape of the response box tended to give people filling in the response more confidence that they'd given the right answer. For example, if we were expecting 1,000 characters, we would shape the response box to accommodate 1,000 characters. And from that, the respondees got more confidence that they'd actually answered the question in a way that we were looking for.
Gosh, that's interesting. So they didn't feel they had to fill the box.
They felt that if they had filled the box, they'd answered the question the way we were expecting. But if they'd only put 1,000 characters into a 2,500 character box, then it gave them a visual clue that we were perhaps expecting a more detailed response or a longer response.
Gosh, that's fascinating. And you haven't written that up anywhere?
No, this is from a very hyper agile corporate scenario where it was just act and respond. But
very much. Yeah. Thanks very much for that. I'm lost my place now. Oh yes, coming on this question of possibly expectations that typed answers should be of higher quality. And Whithouse and colleagues and various other people have found this. It's tempting to think of the writing ability that's measured on a high-stakes exam as first draft writing, and therefore not subject to differences in composing materials or revising. Having the exams keyboarded, typed, seems to have shifted readers' expectations away from first draft writing towards higher expectations associated with texts to be more thoroughly revised. And the students in studies by Nora Mogi and her colleagues in Scotland expressed concern that the shift to typing their exams might lead markers to expect their responses to approach the same standards as the coursework they've typed and had plenty of time to type and revise, and were concerned their marks might be affected. And this did actually crop up a little bit in our work as well. So moving on to the actual process of marking, if students are going to type their exams and submit their scripts online, it could be reasonable to think that academics should actually mark the scripts on the computer as well. We found a number of studies that address the experience of on-screen marking, or OSM, hence the abbreviation, but they looked at on-screen marking of scanned handwritten scripts, and they're mostly done about 10 years or more ago. So one can assume, hopefully, that functionality and usability have improved of the on-screen marking software. But even so, the articles we read told us something about the cognitive strategies that on-screen marking tools need to support. So the first thing is that markers need to be able to extract salient themes and establish the overall sense of the script. And on paper, they do this by skim reading. And in some of the studies of on-screen marking, the participants said they had to read a script several times online to get the overall sense of it. They also need to be able to establish spatial awareness of where particular passages of interest are on the page and the position of the page in the document, so they can refer back to a passage they might have read earlier. And they may also want to flip between scripts to make sure they're marking consistently, for example. And that can be hard to do on a computer screen if you've got an absolutely massive one, than when you can just spread the scripts all over your floor. And they also want to be able to annotate the script, whether to communicate to another reader and a co-marker, or as talking to themselves, commenting to themselves. And some of the studies carried about 10 years ago suggest that markers annotated less on the screen than on paper, suggesting it might have been harder in terms of functionality. You couldn't just scribble something, or the software didn't offer them the notations or the symbols that they might be wanted to use. So that's as far as we got with looking at the marking process. So I think it's time to share, for people to share again. Jill, anything happening in the chat box? I'll pass
Yes,
over to you.
Lots is happening in the chat box, to the extent that I can't keep up with it. Every time I scroll up to read an earlier comment, it jumps because there are many more down below. So I think rather than picking out particular comments, we can always go back to that and look at it in the recording. But I'd like to just open it up to anyone who'd like to raise their hand with a question or a comment. Peter?
Yeah, what technology are the markers offered? Are they expected just to scan visually and type into a box? Do they get any sort of scanning software that helps them identify key phrases or salient themes? Or if you want to use emotion, for example, do they get any of that?
Well, the platform we were using, which was Inspira, has a marking module, but our markers found it rather difficult to use. What it provides is the facility for them to annotate the paper, to insert comments, to underline things. But the suppliers themselves acknowledged that that module needed improvement. In other words, the comment boxes would sometimes move around the screen, and it was rather frustrating at that point for the markers. The suppliers are working on improving that, and in fact, I think they've launched an updated version of the marking module. But that was basically the idea, that just like with track changes or annotating a PDF, the markers could annotate the on-screen script.
I've done a little bit of private work using Amazon Web Services machine learning, in particular their Comprehend product. And just informally, a couple of teachers I was working with appreciated having something as simple as a word cloud and a key phrases list on the side, just to help them get a view and baseline all the different papers that they had. But as I say, that was private and informal, so I haven't written that up either.
And those key phrases, were those key feedback phrases for the lecturer to use, or key phrases gleaned from the student's writing?
Key phrases gleaned from the student's writing, and the idea was to see if the key themes or elements that you were trying to instill into the students were being reflected back in their responses. And we were looking at it was analytical chemistry, and we were wanting to see if any particular, and it was looking at the history of analytical chemistry, and we were wanting to see whether the names of the pioneers were being reflected back, if the titles of the books were being reflected back, to indicate the depth of the study the students had done.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. I see in the chat window someone has asked Jackie if she could expand on her comment. Just let's see what Jackie's comment was. She said that the academics have problems in navigating the paper. Jackie, do you have a mic, and could you perhaps elaborate for us, please? Oh, I see Jackie's responded in the chat. They wanted to know how quick it is to turn the page or pick up the next paper, which could take time if it was a pile of paper-written scripts, I presume. I'm not sure if Jackie can elaborate. Jackie's typing. In the meantime, anyone else would like to raise their hand once we've looked at Jackie's comment? Jackie says, the markers were concerned that online navigation within and between scripts takes a lot longer than just working through your paper pile. Interesting, yes, as Liz and I were saying the other day, when you have a pile of paper scripts, you can spread them out along the on the table or on the floor and easily grab them. So that might have been a concern of markers, acknowledged. Right, I think it's possibly time for Liz to continue with the rest of the presentation. I'm keeping an eye on our time, so over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Jill. They were hopping over those questions. Come on, where's the next one? There we go. Actually, one thing I was noticing from our data was that one of our markers on marking in the exam was saying it's harder to tell whether a student's made a spelling mistake or just a typing error, whereas in handwriting, obviously you haven't got the issue of making typos. Anyway, let's move on to the big question of is there a difference in the marks awarded between handwritten and typed exams, and does it matter? So what's the literature telling us? So let's look at the difference first. Overall, the data are divided, unsurprisingly. In some studies, students who typed were scored higher than handwriters, and in others, it was the other way around. And reasons for higher marks given in handwritten exams, again, handwritten scripts may seem longer, and the errors are more visible in typed scripts. There appeared to be a difference depending on the nature of the scoring rubrics. So analytic scoring, where there are specific criteria laid down for marking, students who would type appear to do better. And that's all I know about that. I'm just reporting what the literature says, so please don't ask me what about that. But in almost all cases, the differences are not statistically significant. And studies have also ruled out the influence of specific demographic factors such as gender and ethnicity and whether English is their first or second language. The lack of consensus amongst these findings can also be attributed to the settings in which they were conducted and the shortcomings in the methods adopted. I mean, mock exams or artificial settings, or just setting students to write essays that you pretend are exams, can influence their attitudes. And some researchers have noticed practice effects where they've tested participants in both handwriting and typing modes. So as well as looking at students' performance, what about differences in the way that the performance of the academics who mark the scripts? Is marking type scripts different? Well, seemingly not in terms of severity and accuracy. In some of the studies we looked at, again, have found that markers were no more severe on typed scripts than on handwritten ones, despite that problem over the expectations of difference that we talked about earlier. But one of Johnson's latest studies seems to have suggested that markers are slightly more lenient when marking on screen than on paper, which sort of goes against what some other people said about handwriting, legible handwriting. Accuracy is the proximity between the mark that the marker awards and the sort of reference mark established by a principal examiner. And in the UK, this is used more in schools, and I never come across it in universities. In terms of reliability, Bridgman and Cooper tentatively suggest that the improvements in reliability on typed scripts may be due to the greater standardization in word process essays in which raters can't attend to differences in handwriting or overall neatness. So that's where that sort of affective dimension might be ruled out in terms of being kind on people's handwriting or responding adversely. And C and colleagues suggests that these on-screen marking tools may contribute to greater inter-rater reliability in two ways. You can split up individual exam papers so that different individuals mark different questions. That's item level as opposed to paper level marking. I'm I'm guessing that you can still do item level marking on paper scripts as well. And collecting analytics as they're going through the overall marking process makes it possible to detect inconsistent or inaccurate marking throughout the marking period, and then take action while it's happening rather than at the end. So to sum up, are typed and handwritten exams equivalent? I think Whithouse and colleagues' paper was the only one that we read that seemed to think there weren't significant differences. And most studies seem to adopt this view by lead that the constructs measured in computer and paper modes are not the same. So incorporating computers into writing involves a whole new way of thinking about composing new answer and writing it. Inevitable sources of non-equivalence of that construct, the output, might lead to differences in test performance to some extent. So if we follow that view, then we can, yes, if we follow that view, we can answer our first two research questions in the affirmative. Yes, the move to e-exams does lead to changes in the processes and outputs of writing and sitting an exam, and in the process and outputs of marking an exam. And to answer the first part of the third research question, they're not equivalent. In which case, what are the implications for policy and practicalities? Well, it can rule out the choice between, it can rule out giving students the choice between handwriting and typewriting, but is their right to choose more important? It also suggests that universities could be advised to provide opportunities for students to improve their typing, but should this be the students' responsibility rather than the universities? And it might even rule out the choice between allowing a choice between marking on paper and on screen, but can you impose that on academics, or is their freedom to choose more important? So these are the three big questions that seem to come out of the work that we read. So regarding that second part, does it matter? Although the differences in academic outcomes may be statistically insignificant, they do matter to students whose marks can hover on the boundaries between grades. I mean, some will benefit and others will be disadvantaged. But we should balance this concern against the inequity that's long existed in handwritten exams, where some students can write more fluently than others and thereby achieve higher marks, all other things being equal. And maybe we should stop puzzling over the conflicting evidence of differences, or designing further studies that attempt yet again to replicate the conditions of high-stakes exams in low-stakes exams or in mock settings in the quest for a definitive answer, inverted commas. Instead, it may be more productive to adopt e-exams across the board and use analytical tools in the e-exam software to understand better students' writing behaviours and academics' marking strategies in that digital medium. And for example, data on the number of the characters that a student types, their typing activity over the course of time, and the length of their script may yield insights that can be used to help them adopt appropriate writing strategies for exams. And I remember going to a talk at Brunel University in the UK, where there's a lot of digital exams are really well embedded. And one of the slides was a graph that showed the relationship, or showed how students were typing over time, and the relationship between I think it was the length of their output, their scripts, and the marks achieved. And that sort of thing can actually quite, seems to be very, very illuminating. Interestingly, studies have already been conducted on typed coursework essays, and a fairly recent paper by Konin, van der Loo, and van Zaanen found discrepancies between what students say they do when typing an essay and what they actually do. And of course that will have implications for all the work we were discussing earlier about students' writing processes that was all based on self-reports. So if we can use these digital tools that give us analytics, and with effective training in IT proficiency assessment, we may find that e-exams are more equitable, or at least less inequitable, than handwritten exams. And that is at that point I will finish, and I will open up the floor and hand over to Jill to facilitate the discussion.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, again, the chat window has been highly active, but everybody's facilitating it very well themselves and responding to each other. So it's a very lively discussion. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. As I say, it continues to grow, the questions and comments there. I think Liz has given us a very good overview of the literature that we reviewed in 2017 and 2018. Clearly, one needs to keep up to date with current studies as our student demographic changes in many ways and the digital literacy of both students and markers hopefully increases. So let's keep our eye on what's happening with current studies, and we'd love to continue contact with participants that we've met today. I see we have got some hands up, so may I ask Peter to take the floor, please?
Sorry for hogging the floor, but I have a pre-prepared provocative question, and that is, why should we even bother with handwritten exams when everything in the business and professional world is done on screen? If you're looking at authentic assessment, then handwritten exams belong in the era of illuminated manuscripts.
Yes, I certainly tend to agree with you. As Liz said towards the end of the presentation, why are we bothering about all these concerns and conflicting results when we should perhaps just do it in the interest of authenticity? Yes,
Can I
Liz?
just pop in there, that we did have one student who had special needs and really couldn't cope with typing at all. So you may actually still need handwritten exams for students with special needs. So just as we've made typing exams an exception in the past, so we need to give students that option where they really do struggle with typing. So I don't think they'll die completely. I mean, the bigger question, which I didn't ask, is it does beg the question of the suitability of exams, writing in time under time pressure. Is that really the best way to assess our students' knowledge? But that's another whole issue.
Yeah, why do we have exams?
Essay exams, where you have to you give them 3 hours to write 4 essays or whatever it is, and you're just even typing.
Mm-hmm.
It's Wendy here. My question sort of relates to what Peter's asking, I guess, in that while this has been looking at the equivalence of handwriting and typing, I wonder if you'd come across any research about thought processes changing when you handwrite. So this is related to some work that I'm doing with the Connected Learning MOOC over a number of years, and we have a postcard where we send postcards to people within the MOOC across the globe. And one thing we've found with that project is that the handwritten word, it does make you think differently. We interact with these same people in the digital sense all the time, but the handwritten aspect and actually the handwritten artefact was very different.
I'll leave you to answer that, Liz, if you've got some thoughts about the cognitive processes that the student goes through and the product.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to do in the first section on looking at planning, rewriting and revising. But as I said, that's very much dependent on student self-reports, which are possibly unreliable. I'm just trying to think, something cropped into my head about the data that we had. I'm just trying to have a look at it. Oh gosh, this is so annoying. Something crops up. What was it? Well, certainly students were saying that when they're typing, planning is easier. It means you need to plan less, and the planning writing become blurred. I know what it was. It was one of the markers who was talking about the difference between typos no, it wasn't, it was a student, sorry, I'm just trying to speak from memory, so we did this over a year ago, and that one student felt actually when you're handwriting, you are very aware of shaping the words, and you're actually less likely to make a mistake, other than a genuine spelling mistake, when you're actually forming the words, whereas when you're typing, or the movement's basically the same, you're just tapping on a key rather than forming a letter. So that's one difference, but that's probably more in the acts of transcription. But I think actually going much more into detail and following, if you can, as far as you can, what's going on inside a student's head when they're writing, and in a sense, the only way of doing that with typing is to use analytics, which of course are only giving a partial representation of what's going on, the externalized representation. We certainly noticed, actually, I don't know whether you did, Jill, when we started up one of the first exam, and we were looking at that sort of dashboard in Inspira, you could see students diving in, some of them typing almost immediately, whereas if they'd handwritten exam, they said they would have actually planned on paper first. And it was really noticeable that some were within 30 seconds, they were in there and typing away. That's about as much as I can answer at the moment, I think. It does need more work.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I'll certainly listen to the first part of the recording again, because it'll relate to what I'm thinking about. And in my example, it is definitely more considered writing, because we're looking at filling a very small space. So what Peter said about changing the space that you're writing, whereas the digital, while it has some restrictions, far less restrictions than writing on a postcard. So yeah, some interesting points there. Thanks. Oh, and just the first draft and second draft, I think that's the difference with my example, where you can draft as many times as you like on a postcard size, and then you can put it into your final and send it off. And you certainly can't do that in an exam situation in most cases. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for your contribution. I see Peter has one more question. It might have to be the last. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and so Peter, fine. Let's hear from you, and then we'll hand back to Matthew.
Just in response to Wendy's remark there, another one of my personal projects was looking at, for e-exams, the capacity to have versioning in the responses, so that if you needed to, you could actually see a thought process or a development of a thought between different versions of a response, rather than just having a blanket response, which I thought would be useful if you're looking at how a person is thinking, then the ability to see version development would be valuable. But that's as far as I've got, just a very simple prototype at the moment.
Very interesting, yes. As was mentioned earlier, different types of assessment would encourage different thought processes. It makes me think of a portfolio where one can see the students' development as they've learned more and being able to express more.
Yep, absolutely.
And one would be able to then, as you say, ask them to submit different drafts so that you can see that progression.
Or automatically just take a draft take a version every 3 minutes and put it away, just like Google Docs does. You don't need to have it overt. It can be hidden.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
That might add to the time spent marking, or unless you could automate it in some way and so the computer do a quick analysis to show the marker.
Yeah, context is important. It might be valuable in some contexts, for example, in humanities, but it might be less valuable in a technical subject like mathematics. It would need to be contextualized.
Good. Okay. I think I need to hand back to Matthew to finalize our session. Thank you everyone for your contributions. It's been a most interesting and lively discussion. And thank you, Liz, for being our main presenter.
Thank you. And I've just put up on the slide the links to the e-exams, the landscape report, the evaluation report. We can't really make publicly available, but if you're interested in it, we can send it to you. There's a link to the conference proceedings for the paper that was actually published in the proceedings, even though I didn't actually give the presentation, and then our email addresses. I've just left the university, so it's a personal email address for me. Thank you very much indeed for coming. It's been great.
Okay, so thank you, Liz and Jill. Okay, I'm just going to click through to the last slide. There's some image credits there, just to be official. And if we could please give some feedback. Unfortunately, the old feedback, there's a feedback link in the text chat. I will share your feedback with the presenters as well. But that, of course, helps us to keep going by being able to justify my time spent on this activity. We all work in universities, we know what it's like. So thank you very much for joining. Let me just see what's on next week. We will be looking at a topic that's actually quite related to this one, related to online exams, the Tesla project in Europe, multi-factor verification for online exams. They use multi-factor biometric identification. So hopefully we'll be seeing you all back again in about a month's time for that session. I'm going to close the recording and thank you very much.